He grabbed my arm so hard I felt it in my shoulder. Security pulled me toward the door of my own house while his family watched and said nothing. I remember thinking, this is it, this is how it ends. But then the front door opened again. And my father walked in. Hey, welcome back. If this is your first time here, I tell real, raw stories about love, respect, and the moments that change everything. Today's story is one I've been wanting to share for a while because it still gives me chills every time I think about it. Before we start, do me a favor, hit that subscribe button and drop a comment telling me where you're watching from. You're going to want to talk about this one by the end. Okay, let's get into it. I used to believe that love was supposed to feel like relief, like finally exhaling after holding your breath your whole life. That's what it felt like when I met my husband. I was 31, tired of dating men who couldn't hold a conversation past dinner, and then this man walked into my life like he'd been sent on purpose. He was smart, successful, the kind of charming that made a whole room lean in when he spoke. And when he looked at me, I felt like the only woman in the world. We moved fast. Some people said too fast, but when you've spent years feeling invisible and someone finally sees you, really sees you, it's hard to slow down. Within 8 months, we were engaged. Within a year, married. I remember standing at the altar thinking I finally did it. I finally found my person. Looking back now, I can see the cracks were there from the very beginning. I just didn't want to see them. It started small. The way he'd correct how I dressed before we went to dinner with his colleagues. The way he'd get quiet, almost cold, if I said something he thought made him look bad in front of people. I told myself it was just him being particular. Some men care a lot about image, I said. That's not a red flag, that's just personality. But personality doesn't explain the way his mother looked at me the first time we met. It was a look I knew well. A look that said, "You are not what I imagined for my son." She was polite enough technically. She smiled, she shook my hand, she complimented my dress. But there was something underneath all of it, something cold, something that made it clear I would always be a guest in that family, never truly a part of it. I remember driving home that night and my husband asking me why I was so quiet. I told him his mother made me uncomfortable. And instead of asking why, instead of holding my hand and saying, "I'm sorry, let's talk about it," he sighed and said, "She's just old school, give her time." That was the first time I learned that in this marriage, my feelings would always come second to keeping the peace with his family. I gave her time. I gave her a lot of time. 2 years, in fact. And in that time, I learned to shrink myself a little more at every gathering, to laugh a little softer, to speak a little less, all in the name of keeping things smooth. There's a particular kind of tired that comes from constantly managing how other people feel about you. I didn't have a name for it back then, but I know it now. It's the tired of always being the one who adjusts. His sister was worse than his mother, honestly. She had this way of making comments that sounded like compliments but landed like insults. Things like, "You're actually really well spoken," said with genuine surprise, like she expected something different from me. Or, "I love that you kept your look natural, some women try too hard," while glancing at my hair like it was a topic up for public discussion. I brought it up to my husband more than once, and every single time the response was some version of the same thing. "You're too sensitive. She didn't mean it like that. You're reading into things." After a while, I stopped bringing it up altogether because I got tired of being told my own experience wasn't real. That's a strange kind of loneliness, by the way. Being surrounded by people, married to someone, and still feeling like nobody in the room is on your side. My father noticed before I let myself notice. He's always been like that, sharp, observant, the kind of man who reads a room in seconds. He's spent over 20 years in law enforcement, worked his way up from the ground floor to becoming police commissioner. And if there's one thing that job teaches you, it's how to spot when something is wrong before people say it out loud. I remember visiting him one Sunday the way I always did, and he asked me straight out, "Is everything okay with you and your husband?" I told him everything was fine. Great, actually. I smiled while I said it, the way you do when you're trying to convince yourself as much as the other person. He didn't push, that's not his style. He just looked at me for a long moment and said, "You know you can always tell me the truth. No matter what it is." I nodded, thanked him, and changed the subject. I wasn't ready to admit, even to myself, that my marriage wasn't the fairy tale I kept telling everyone it was. Looking back, I think some part of me already knew where this was heading. I just wasn't ready to face it yet. There was a dinner at my husband's family home that changed everything. It wasn't a special occasion, just one of those routine gatherings his family loved to host, filled with his father's business partners, a few cousins, some old family friends. The kind of event where every word out of your mouth feels like it's being graded. I remember getting dressed that evening, going back and forth on 3 different outfits because I knew, without him even saying it, that whatever I chose would be silently judged the second I walked through that door. I settled on something simple, elegant, nothing flashy. I thought surely tonight will be fine. It wasn't fine. Dinner started normal enough. Small talk, wine, the usual performance of politeness. But about an hour in, his sister brought up something about my job, made a comment questioning how I'd managed to get where I was, in that tone that always implied I hadn't earned it the way everyone else had. I let it slide the first time. But then his mother added her own comment on top of it, something about how times have changed and certain people get certain opportunities now. The table went quiet in that awkward way where everyone heard it but nobody wanted to acknowledge it. I looked at my husband. I needed him to say something, anything, just one sentence in my defense. Instead, he laughed it off, made a joke to break the tension, and moved the conversation along like nothing had happened. Something in me cracked that night, not loudly, quietly. Like a small tear you don't notice until you pull on it and the whole seam gives way. I didn't make a scene at dinner. I held it together the way I'd trained myself to do for years. But in the car on the way home, I finally let it out. I told him how that comment made me feel, how tired I was of being the only one defending myself at every single family gathering, how I needed him just once to stand up for me the way a husband is supposed to. He got defensive immediately. Told me I was making it a bigger deal than it was. Told me his family had been nothing but welcoming, and I was the one causing problems by always finding something to be upset about. I remember sitting in that car feeling smaller than I had ever felt in my entire life. That fight didn't end that night. It followed us home, into the house, into the kitchen, up the stairs. Voices got louder. Old grievances I'd swallowed for years started spilling out, all at once, because once that dam breaks, everything comes rushing through it. And then, in the middle of all of it, his mother and sister showed up. I don't even fully know why, whether they'd followed us or he'd called them, but suddenly they were standing in my living room, adding fuel to an already burning fire. His mother started talking about how I was unstable, how I was not the right fit for this family, how she'd known this from the beginning. I was standing in my own home being talked about like I wasn't even in the room. And then my husband said the words I will never forget. He turned to the security guard who worked the gate at his family's properties, the same one who had driven his mother and sister over, and he said, "Get her out of here." I thought I misheard him. I asked him to repeat himself, my voice shaking. He looked me dead in the eye, no hesitation, no softness, and said it again. "Get her out, now." The security guard, clearly uncomfortable but following orders, walked toward me. I told him not to touch me. I told him this was my home too, my name was on that lease just as much as my husband's. But he grabbed my arm anyway, and I felt the grip tighten as he started pulling me toward the front door. I was pulling back, telling him to let go, telling my husband to say something, do something, stop this. His mother stood there with her arms crossed, almost satisfied. His sister looked away like she couldn't quite watch, but she didn't say a word either. My husband just stood there, arms crossed, silent, letting it happen. I remember the exact feeling of that moment. Not just the pain in my arm, but the deeper pain of realizing that the man I married was willing to let another man physically remove me from my own home, in front of his family, without lifting a single finger to stop it. I don't fully know how he got there so fast. I found out later that a neighbor, someone who'd met my father a handful of times at family events, recognized the commotion and made a call. I don't think I'll ever be able to properly thank that neighbor. The front door opened just as the security guard had me halfway across the living room, my arm still in his grip, my shoes half off from struggling. And there he was, my father. Still in part of his uniform from an earlier event that evening, which somehow made the moment even more surreal. The room went completely silent. I want you to understand something about my father. He is not a loud man. He's never needed to raise his voice to make people listen. 20 plus years of commanding rooms full of officers, of walking into chaos and bringing order, has given him a kind of stillness that is more powerful than any shouting could ever be. He didn't yell. He didn't rush across the room. He simply stood in the doorway for a moment, taking in the entire scene, my arm still gripped by a man who clearly had no idea what he'd just walked into the middle of. And then, in a voice that was calm, low, and absolutely unshakable, he said one sentence: "Remove your hand from my daughter right now." The security guard let go immediately. I think some instinct in him recognized authority even before his brain caught up with who exactly was standing in that doorway. My husband's face changed in an instant. I watched the color drain from it, his mother's arms uncrossed. His sister actually took a step back. Because in that moment, they weren't looking at my father as my father anymore. They were looking at the police commissioner, standing in the middle of a scene that any one of them could be held accountable for. My father walked further into the room, slow, deliberate steps, his eyes moving from me to the guard to my husband to his mother, taking in every single detail like he was building a case in real time, which in a way he was. "Would someone like to explain to me," he said, still in that same calm, level voice, Why I just walked in to find my daughter being dragged out of her own home by a man I don't even know. Nobody answered right away. The silence in that room was heavier than anything I'd ever felt. My husband finally spoke, stammering through some version of an explanation that things had gotten heated, that it was a misunderstanding, that nobody meant for it to look the way it looked. My father listened without interrupting, without reacting, just letting him talk himself into deeper and deeper trouble. When my husband finally finished, my father turned to me. "Do you want to tell me what actually happened?" he asked. And for the first time in years, I felt permission to say the truth out loud. The whole truth, not the softened, edited version I'd been giving everyone, including myself, for so long. So I told him. I told him about the years of comments from his mother and sister that got brushed off as jokes. I told him about how my husband never once defended me, not at that dinner, not tonight, not ever. I told him about feeling smaller and smaller every year of this marriage, about learning to shrink myself just to keep the peace. And finally, I told him what happened tonight, how I was told to get out of my own home, how a stranger's hand was put on my arm because my husband couldn't be bothered to use his own voice. My husband tried to interject a few times, tried to soften certain parts, tried to paint himself as caught in the middle rather than the one who gave the order. But my father held up one hand, and that was enough to stop him mid-sentence. "I'm listening to her right now," he said. "You'll have your turn." When I finished, the room was quiet again. My father looked at his mother directly and said, "And you thought it was appropriate to stand here and let this happen in front of you without saying a word?" She didn't have an answer. For the first time since I'd known her, she looked genuinely uncomfortable, genuinely small. Then he turned to my husband. And this is the part I'll never forget. He didn't yell, he didn't threaten. He simply said very calmly, "You called a security guard to physically remove my daughter from her home. Do you understand what that looks like from where I'm standing? Do you understand the position that puts you in?" My husband started to backpedal immediately, apologizing, saying he'd overreacted, that he loved me, that this wasn't who he really was. But my father cut through all of it with one simple line. "The version of you I just saw walk into this room, the one who let another man put his hands on his wife without saying a single word to stop it, that's exactly who you really are. Actions tell the truth, words are just noise after the fact." I watched my husband's face as those words landed. I watched him realize in real time that there would be no smoothing this over, no charming his way out of it, no blaming me until I apologized for his behavior the way he'd trained me to do for years. "I want to be honest with you about something." In that moment, part of me almost felt bad for him. Isn't that strange? After everything, some small part of me still wanted to protect his feelings, still wanted to smooth things over the way I always had. That's what years of shrinking yourself does to you. It rewires your instincts. But then I looked at my arm, at the mark already forming where the guard had gripped it, and I looked at my husband standing there, more concerned with how this would affect his reputation than with the fact that his wife had just been manhandled in her own living room. And something in me settled, quietly, firmly. I wasn't going to shrink myself for this man one more day. I didn't scream. I didn't cry, not there, not in front of everyone. I simply said, calm as I could manage, "I want a divorce." I said it once clearly, and I didn't take it back. My father didn't push me one way or another in that moment. He didn't tell me what to do. He just stood beside me, present, solid, the way he'd always been my entire life, and let me make that decision on my own terms. That mattered more to me than anything else that happened that night. The days that followed were a blur of lawyers and boxes and difficult phone calls. His family, predictably, tried to paint the whole thing differently once the shock wore off, tried to suggest I was overreacting, tried to smooth their own image the way they always had. But there's something about having a witness with that kind of authority and integrity in the room that makes it very hard to rewrite the story afterward. His career took a hit, not because my father used his position to punish him. My father would never do that, but simply because word travels, and people remember exactly what kind of man does something like that to his own wife. Some doors that used to open easily for him started staying closed. That wasn't revenge. That was just consequence showing up naturally, the way it tends to when you show people who you really are. I remember the night I left that house for the last time, standing in the driveway with a few boxes in my car, looking back at the place I thought was going to be my forever home. And instead of feeling broken, I felt something I hadn't felt in years. Light, like I'd been carrying a weight so long I'd forgotten what my own shoulders felt like without it. It's been a while since that night now, long enough that I can tell this story without my voice shaking the way it used to. I rebuilt slowly. Some days were harder than others, especially in the beginning, when the silence of living alone again felt unfamiliar after years of adjusting myself around someone else's moods. But in that silence, I found something I'd lost a long time ago: my own voice. I started speaking up in situations where I used to stay quiet. I started noticing when someone tried to make me feel small, and instead of shrinking, I stood a little taller. My relationship with my father grew even closer after everything. We'd always been close, but there's something about a man showing up for you in your worst moment, without hesitation, without judgment, just steady presence and quiet strength, that deepens a bond in a way words never could. We still have dinner together every single week. And every time before we say goodbye, he tells me the same thing. I'm proud of the way you handled that, not the leaving, the way you finally said what you needed to say. I think about that dinner sometimes, the one that started everything unraveling. And I think about how close I came to staying quiet forever, to letting that be just another uncomfortable evening I brushed under the rug the way I'd brushed away so many others. If that night hadn't happened, if my father hadn't walked through that door at that exact moment, I honestly don't know how much longer I would have stayed shrinking myself in a marriage that was never going to make room for who I really was. Here's what I want you to take from this story, if nothing else. Pay attention to the small moments, the comments that get laughed off, the silence when you needed someone to speak up for you. Those moments are not small. They are previews of everything that's coming if you let them keep happening. And you deserve a love that doesn't require you to make yourself smaller just to keep the peace. I found that out the hard way. I hope you find it out the easy way, by recognizing it early and choosing yourself before someone else has to walk through the door and choose you first. Thank you so much for staying with me through this one. Stories like this are hard to tell, but they're even harder to keep quiet. I'd love to know, honestly, what would you have done in that moment? Would you have stayed quiet or would you have spoken up sooner? Drop your thoughts in the comments. I read every single one. If this story moved you, please hit that like button, subscribe if you haven't already, and share it with someone who needs to hear it today. There's another story coming very soon, and trust me, you don't want to miss it. Take care of yourselves, and I'll see you in the next one.